All right, we're now live. Wait for people to sign on in to our Zoom webinar, but welcome. Happy Thursday morning or Thursday afternoon, depending on where you are.
Yeah, in Australia, it's actually already Friday, I believe.
That's fair. I guess it's not, yes. So happy Thursday or Friday if you're signing in from Australia. That's right. It's great. Nice to see some familiar names and also nice to see some unfamiliar names. We'll give everybody just a couple of minutes. As I told Urs, my clock on my computer is 2 minutes behind. So if yours are as well, then we'll make sure that you have time to sign in here. First time joining from Ohio. Well, welcome, Lauren.
Hi.
Great to have you.
Welcome, Lauren. If you want to connect or ask a question, just use the chat button, actually. That'd be good.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, please feel free to use the chat. We'll be able to see that. If you use the Q&A, it may or may not pop up, but the chat definitely will. So. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Again, happy Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, Friday from Australia. Hello from Black Mountain, North Carolina. Great to have you here, Jennifer Billstrom. Wonderful to again be joining all of you on a Thursday morning for Crisis Communications. And this is a conversation between my friend and colleague, Urs Koenig, and my name is Shannon Huffman Polson. I'm the founder of the Grit Institute, which is an online leadership development platform. Also the author of The Grit Factor, which is releasing in September from Harvard Business Review Press. I'm an author, a speaker, veteran of Army aviation and of the corporate world as well. And I have enjoyed the chance to look at leadership through the lens of my clients over the past nearly decade across the country and actually around the world. So, Urs, I'd love them.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for being here, everybody. It's great to see you. My name is Urs Koenig. As you can tell, I'm not from this country. I'm from Switzerland originally. I have been a student of leadership for most of my life as a keynote speaker, most recently as an executive coach for the last 20 years, as a military peacekeeper, 3 years in Kosovo, this fall again in the Middle East for a year, and as an ultra-endurance competitor. I'm super excited to be here. This is the third out of 6 chats that Shannon and I are having, and I'm looking forward to it.
And we look forward to hearing from all of you, both in the chat, but also after the webinar, to know what you think, what you'd recommend. If there's anything you'd like us to cover in the coming weeks, we have a few ideas, but if you have others, we'd love to consider those as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. We try to keep these to 15 to 20 minutes, sort of a coffee chat. I think all of us have busy lives and plenty of time on the screens, and 15 to 20 minutes seems like a great way to convey 2 or 3 really important points, and ideally a few things that you can take away and take into your life right away. So today, Urs and I are going to talk a little bit about the specific aspect of transparency in crisis communication, and not just transparency, but maybe even radical transparency. One of the things that came to mind as we were discussing what we need to be aware of in a situation like this, an uncertain time, even possibly a frightening time, is how leaders really need to be visible to their people, but also how we need to look at potentially addressing the cadence of communication within an organization in a time of crisis. Urs, you had a great example, a historical example, I think, going back to the idea of visibility.
Yes. So, this notion that now is really the time to not hunker down. We gotta be visible as leaders. And there is the great story about the British naval officers during the height of the British Empire. They were expected to stand erect, totally visible to enemy fire on the deck of their ship, not because there was little value placed on their lives, but rather because there was big value placed on their leadership. Simply by being visible and present to their sailors, they provided some comfort for the sailors in the midst of chaos. And that's sort of a nice metaphor for how we ought to show up during this time of crisis. Being visible, being there for our clients. And our people. So one of the people I talked to recently is actually the head of school of my kids. And what does he do? to be visible. He actually logs in regularly as the head of school into the online classrooms to be present with his teachers and his kids, much like he would have done if the campus was open. So those two concepts, those two examples are really exemplifying the concept of needing to be visible for our people.
I love those examples, and actually what a great example that is relevant to the modern world too, about really checking in with the classrooms, with the teachers, with the students. I think people really do need to see the person in charge to have that confidence in the midst of times that are uncertain. And it is interesting, Urs, I love that you said don't hunker down, because so many of us have been using that term, like it's time to hunker down. And it is certainly time to be safe, there's no question, and to make safe decisions, but for the health and the safety of all of us. But I think at the same time, you're right, a leader cannot afford to hunker down right now. A leader has to be visible. And I know in the Army we had the example of the commanders, and there's a guidon carrier, right? And this is obviously a different time. This is a long time ago when people would fight like this, but the guidon was this flag that's always out in front, and people would die to keep that guidon in the air, because the soldiers needed to be able to see that example that they were still moving forward, that the leader was still present. And so, yeah, those military examples are actually pretty great, right? It's the necessity of being able to see that you are moving forward, that there is somebody in charge, and there's a confidence that comes with that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
For sure. And we talked about in the very first chat, Shannon, we talked about grounding and horizon, right? So yes. The grounding is, how do I step through the minefield, putting one foot in front of the other? So that's sort of more the hunkering down. And really our jobs as leaders the job is to rise our sight up and look at the horizon. And you bring up a great point, which is, there's two things going on simultaneously for us as leaders here. On the one hand, it is imperative that we're visible and that we're on top of our stuff. So we need to be tough on results with ourselves and our teams. It is a make or break time for many of us. One of my good friends in Switzerland, he's in charge of all the sports organizations and sports facilities and school sports in the city of Zurich. And he told me the best leaders in my organization, they're now rising to the top. And those who sort of, I wasn't quite sure about them, they're actually sort of fizzling out to the bottom. And so, leadership sometimes it is a Broadway play. The show is always on. When the lights go on, you got to be ready. And so that's sort of the tough on results. And that's true. And at the same time, we also, as we have talked here, we need to provide an adequate level of vulnerability and transparency around how we're feeling and what's going on for ourselves, and reveal in an adequate way. So there is, that's why, as Shannon and I say, it's a leadership is a thinking person sport. So it's both of these things that we need to balance during this crisis.
That's right, because your people really do. I mean, I think on that transparency and that vulnerability piece, I mean, we talked about this earlier this week, Urs, but there's a balance, of course, because you don't share everything that's happening to you in the moment necessarily, right? I think you were saying that's really vulnerability versus TMI. So, and it's true, because your people need to feel, whoever your people are, it's your family, it's your colleagues, it's your clients, they need to know that things are under control, or at least have a sense that there is a plan. So there's a little bit of a sense of you're providing that vision, you're providing that access to that horizon that may not be visible to them right now. And at the same time, being relatable to them, like understanding where they are by showing that you're there too. Like you may be also a bit unsettled. You understand that it's an uncertain time. You're feeling that yourself. And so there's a relatability aspect to that, while still keeping your eye going forward, keeping people's eye on the horizon and showing a way through that. So that is important, to be able to be transparent about the reality, the challenges, what you're feeling, but still be able to show a vision that does negotiate through the challenge.
Yeah. And Shannon, we have a question on the chat, not talking about the name here, but then I need to put my glasses on to read this. What can we do as mid-level leaders to help ourselves and our colleagues to open up the line of communication? Even if we don't know what's going on, or if we feel that some people are withholding information. Shannon, any thoughts?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things, and this would obviously depend on the organizational structure for sure. I think that one thing could be to, let's see, colleagues that are holding information, the leadership to open the line of communication. I think in terms of the colleagues, I almost wonder, again, depending on the structure and your position, I wonder if there's a way to yourself hold some regular updates with like team updates or team check-ins and just say, hey, I want to start scheduling a team check-in. And this is kind of what I understand is going on. What do you understand is going on? And then I would maybe even make a request to the leadership to do something similar. And the request may or may not be, as we have found in various examples in our own community here, may or may not be responded to in the way that you hoped, but almost leading the way yourself. And I like to say that you can lead from any seat, right? It doesn't matter if you're the janitor, doesn't matter if you're the administrative assistant, you can lead from any seat. And so I would suggest thinking of some way to even have a casual weekly check-in. And you could maybe address it by saying, it would be nice for us to all get together once a week and just have a time to chat, and then try to maybe quietly structure that. I guess that's not being radically transparent up front, but I think it would be moving towards that transparency in the long run. And again, it really depends on the organization. But.
Right, and I like the set structure around how we communicate. So there is a reason why politicians do the daily briefing. Even if there's nothing new to report, for us as the audience, for our people to know that there is a briefing coming up and they will communicate whatever they know at that point, that gives us a certain level of comfort. You know, and I'd like to tell my clients, book more meetings that you're comfortable right now. Send more email updates than you think are necessary. You can always scale down. So I really feel what you're talking about, Shan, is to lead by example, to demonstrate within your team, within your universe, yes, what can be done in terms of open and transparent communication. And yes, then, you know, lead from any seat, as Shan is saying, sideways and up, and use your influence to push radical transparency through the organization.
Yeah, and it is a hard thing. I don't want to presume at all that it's easy. I know the follow-up comment was it's a very large organization, lots of different meetings, but many people don't necessarily know all their new responsibilities in the midst of potential restructuring. So, and for there, I'd recommend, in terms of managing up on that transparency and that communication, is going to whoever it is that you report to and saying, hey, I'm not entirely clear about this. Could you help to clarify? And if you have people reporting to you that also have new responsibilities more in a matrix sort of organization, for example, saying, you know, I need to know how to clarify these specifics for my team, and really going respectfully and seeking out that information. I think that's part of the leadership in a matrixed organization. It's less military, right, where it's more directive. There's a few of us on small teams where that might be the case, but in a more matrix group, you may have to go request that information and say, this isn't clear. Could you lay this out for us?
Yeah. If you're at the receiving end of this, if people come to you, there's one point I think which is a very important thing to emphasize. If we don't know, if we truly don't know, we say so. You know, yes, we can always recover from mistakes. We can never recover from a loss of credibility. And the worst we can do is to pretend we know more than we actually do. And so that is a certain, you know, I almost want to say maturity we need to have as a leader to actually be comfortable enough to say that I don't know. I don't have the answer to this.
That's a really important point, Urs. And actually, in terms of this concept of radical transparency, maybe almost the most important is to be able to be honest about where you are, especially if you're not the one in charge. And actually, even if you are the one in charge, to maybe admit, like, we don't know exactly the way through this right now. This is what we're working on in the intermediate term, but we don't necessarily know the long game, but we're going to stay in touch with you to let you know how things are continuing to change. Again, the specifics of that communication will change as you go along, but you're right. You do have to be willing to admit when you don't know. And that is a very hard thing for a number of us to do when we've had experience under our belts and feel like we should be able to have the answer. And most people don't have the answer right now. That's just the reality of it, right? But you know, one of the things that, going back to this grounding and horizon concept, is it is so important to be able to really be focused on the reality of the circumstances today, which are changing constantly, which is why we'll come to the next point, which is the cadence of communication as well. It's changing constantly, and yet we have to understand what's happening now, be realistic about what's happening now, be realistic about our fears or our uncertainties, and yet still show the way through, right? And to do that, maybe that is a good seg, just in the interest of our 15 to 20 minute time together, to talk about that cadence of communication, Urs, because I know many of us may have had meetings set up on a certain cadence before, and now we're in a very different time and communicating in a different way. So how do you think about that in a time of crisis?
So, I really think it's virtually impossible to over-communicate. I mean, this isn't rocket science, right? We all sort of intuitively understand that. It's impossible to over-communicate. And so I think one thing we all ought to do as leaders is to look at our meeting cadence, our one-on-ones, our department meetings, our all hands, town halls, whatever you want to call them, and really ratcheting it up and thinking about how can I increase the frequency and make them brief, make them more frequent, make them brief in similar how we do this this morning. So that is something that we all ought to look at as an organization. It can't be that we are doing the same cadence with our meetings now than we used to 3 months ago. I have one client who sends out a weekly CEO memo. He didn't do that before, but sort of in the spirit of keeping his people informed. I've read about another business where they now post daily revenue forecasts, which seems a little bit over the top, but still it is in the interest of keeping people up to date every day when they open up their laptop in their home office and they see what the daily revenue forecast is. So ratcheting it up is sort of the name of the game.
And I think we've talked about how in a time of uncertainty, it is not possible to over communicate. I think in our regular cadence, it is possible to have too many meetings. Most of us do, many of us have. But right now you can't over communicate, and it is figuring out the right methods of communication to make sure that that information is available. And those are two great examples with a daily updated revenue forecast or a weekly CEO report. I actually heard that Satya Nadella recently sent something out, even with a poem from Seamus Heaney. I haven't seen it myself, but I think that's just wonderful. So finding other ways to communicate that meet the needs of the people to whom you're communicating, and that goes back a little bit to what we talked about last time, which is listening, understanding your audience, understanding where they are and what it is that they need. So that is absolutely important. There's an example that came up in a interview that I did for the Grit Factor, which was Lieutenant General Nadia West, and she's the first African-American woman to reach the rank of 3 stars in the United States Army, also the first African-American Surgeon General. And she had this very difficult job at one point of drawing down a hospital. So a huge civilian staff, some military as well that were going to be relocated, really, really difficult and hard messages to be able to deliver. And she set up a weekly town hall. And that weekly town hall was this opportunity for people to come together, ask any questions that they wanted to ask. She could make sure there was this increased and regular cadence of communication so people knew what was happening. There's fear in the unknown, right? And we're all experiencing that right now. But as a leader, you can make things a little bit less frightening by making things a little bit more known. And I think that looking at that cadence of communication, increasing it, and finding the right ways to communicate with your team is a really outstanding opportunity right now for everybody.
Let me share one last thing, and then I think we should slowly wrap it, Shannon.
Yeah.
What's more important now than ever is our intentionality around how we communicate. When Shannon and I do keynotes, we ask ourselves these 3 questions. What do I want the audience to think, feel, do? So asking ourselves as we communicate by email, town hall, one-on-ones, what do I want my people to think, feel, or do? So for us today, we want you to think that 20 minutes is a great length. We want you to feel that despite all that's going on, there is some things I can actually implement immediately, and then do. We want you to actually take one little piece and implement it based on what you're hearing today.
And we'd love to hear that from you afterwards. Send us an email or find us on media on LinkedIn, or Urs is at urskoenigspeaker.com. I'm at shannonpolson.com. We'd love to hear from you what you think, also what you'd like to hear about in the next 3 weeks. It's really a pleasure to spend this time with you. And again, radical transparency, remembering that leaders need to be visible during this time, ensuring that you're visible, more visible maybe than you think you want to be or are comfortable being even. And then really looking for ways to consider your cadence of communication and ensure that it's adequate to the times that we're in, which means more frequent communication, really looking at the needs of your audience. So I hope that you could take something away from that for today into your next week. Again, we're really excited to be able to spend these Thursday mornings or Thursday afternoons on the East Coast or Fridays with you in Australia. And we look forward again to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.